Hello everyone, this is Dr. Joel Goodin. Welcome back. We're going to be discussing research questions in Chapter 1 and how to do them for your dissertation. I think one thing to note that's really important in the research questions before we get started is that they're going to be different based on whether you're qualitative or quantitative. The other important point is to point out that they need to be infused. They need to contain the wording from your theoretical framework. If you haven't chosen a theoretical framework that aligns with your purpose yet, you probably should do that first, because your research questions will likely be modified to include components or constructs, information, or at least wording from your framework. So imagine, let's start with this. Present research questions directly answerable, specific and testable, within the given time frame and location identified in the problem and purpose statements. In other words, be consistent with what you've said before. Not just be consistent generally, but also be aligned. Those two things. Be consistent with the details, but also aligned in the sort of meta conversation that you're presenting, the components of the study, the problem, the purpose, the framework, the research questions. And so it also says include the exact same variables. This is about consistency. The same variables and constructs, participants, and location mentioned in the problem and purpose. You don't want to switch from a problem that dealt with Asian Pacific Islanders and suddenly your purpose is about studying the Latino population. You don't want to switch variables. You don't want to switch constructs. You want to maintain a consistent, logical story where people can follow it from A to Z. So, one thing I'll note here is that your research questions, let's say they're qualitative. If they're qualitative, you will not have hypotheses. We do not create hypotheses typically. Based on my experience, we do not create hypotheses for qualitative research questions. That's probably typical of most universities, but you can double check with your chair wherever they may be. The other thing I'll note is that when you do have a quantitative study, you will have hypotheses. For every research question, you will have one null hypothesis and one alternative hypothesis. For the second research question, a null and an alternative. And these will have statistical wording. So your research questions will be in terms of statistics, testing whatever quantitative relationship you're trying to understand or prove or determine or test the influence of. And so let's get into some of that wording here. So I'll say first, we'll just call this wording matters. Okay, and so for a qualitative, you might say words like how, when, how, why, not when, in what ways. Basically, you're asking questions like, it could be, what are the perceptions of API individuals toward, let's go with secondary education instructors, school teachers, toward virtual transition during a time of pandemic. This video is being created during the COVID-19 situation, and so this type of language, perceptions, which I spelled wrong, sorry, It could be sort of a case study. Might be appropriate for a case study or a basic qualitative design. Okay, another type of sort of qualitative approach would be sort of a phenomenological, where you might say something like, what are the lived experiences? You want to put sort of those buzzwords in there that sort of align with that type of design that you're using. Phenomenology often discusses lived experiences. So what are the lived experiences of, I'm going to say SEI, secondary education instructors, with regard to virtual teaching during a time of pandemic? And like I said, this could be more of a phenomenological study. You might even say, what role does professional development play in the success of students? And let's say we're talking suddenly switching our topic of our study to like dissertating students, doctoral students. And so we could say that we want to stay away from sort of causal wording, and so what role does it play is sort of a way to avoid that. Some other wording that might help: how does PD inform student success? And sort of we're staying away from words like influence or impact or effect, words like that. And then for quantitative, you are going to have sort of, you could ask something as simple as, what is the frequency of X variable? What is the relationship? It could be a relationship study, like a correlational, simple correlational study. Or it could be some sort of quasi-experimental or experimental study, where you sort of get into some sort of causal determination. With quantitative studies, we can get into causal determinations, but we try to avoid getting into causal inference, even on the part of the participants, by saying, we don't want to really have them make assertions about what they think causes something. We want their perceptions and their lived experiences, but we might try to avoid having them sort of make causal determinations and their guesses against that, because that's really not the goal of a qualitative research. Is to understand and explore, going back to the purpose wording, to understand and explore rather than to identify, to determine, to measure, things like that. And so I'm going to go back up here and say, the next thing that I want to say is framework inclusion. I don't know if that's the word. Framework, yeah, inclusion. I like that. Okay, so what I mean by that is, let's say we have a theory, and it's a theory 12, we'll call it, says, or has 3 primary principles. And instead of spelling them out, I'll just say, let's say they're A, B, and C. So A says, whatever A is important, or A says professional development is important for student success. And I'm going to rename this study Theory Student Success, or let's just put it up here, Student Success theory. Citation is made up, not a real theory. It could be by somebody else. Second principle is that academic rigor is important for student success. And third principle, let's say, is student emotional health is important to student success, right? So these three things matter. And let's say we were working with a framework and we've already nailed it down. This is a framework that works well with whatever purpose is in our study. You're going to have your own framework that's talking about something completely different. It may have 5 principles or 2 or 20. If it has 20, I encourage you to not cover all 20. But let's say it has 3, and these are them. And so let's look at, I actually pre-worded some of this. So what I did was I infused, maybe that's what I should have said, infusion. Sounds like water, sparkling water or something. All right, and I spelled that wrong. Okay, so note to everybody out there, by the way, is that constantly fix your mistakes. Notice and fix. You're not a robot, you're going to have mistakes, but keep noticing, keep fixing, otherwise it creates this big pile of rubbish that starts to smell, and you're going to have to deal with it as a big pile instead of piece by piece. So, side note. You're going to use these types of words, but here's the question that we asked. What are the perceptions? Okay. Now this question, note that it doesn't really have anything from the SST, the Student Success Theory, right? It's just sort of general. But what if we had this one? We have infused the wording or an important construct or concept from the theory into our sentence. So this is principle A, right? And then we could say, in what ways does academic rigor inform student success? Or we might say, what are the perceptions of the role that academic rigor plays in student success? And we need to say by whom. Okay, and this would also be academic rigor, which is the principle B. Right? And here I was another attempt at getting at principle B. I don't suggest you use 2 different ones unless they're covering different territory. You don't want your research questions to overlap in terms of their purpose, in terms of covering theoretical content and in terms of doing what the purpose needs to do. And I use this example a lot, sort of metaphor example. If the think of the RQs as the hands of the purpose. They focus the purpose on specific questions that are overarching. Then think of the interview questions, let's say you do interview questions, as the fingers of those hands, research questions. Okay, So basically, let me go back. What we're really showing here is that our problem leads to a purpose that's going to address the problem. And to be clear, the problem should come from current lit. The purpose then is to address that problem. It's pretty vague. And then we're getting more focused research questions. Do the work of accomplishing the purpose infused with the key components of the framework. And I should probably put the framework right after the purpose and say the framework is chosen as a lens by which to understand the phenomena identified in the purpose. So here again we have, I'll call this the cycle. The problem that scholars, and by this I mean research problem, the purpose to address the problem, the framework is chosen as a lens by which to understand the phenomena identified in the purpose. The RQs do the work of accomplishing the purpose it is infused with the key components from that framework that we chose. And then let's say you're doing a qualitative study. The interview questions, So basically, by asking the interview questions, you hope to elicit responses from participants that will be sufficient and appropriate to respond to the RQs. Right? So going backwards. Responses to the RQs should inform, provide a display of the purpose accomplishment. Did you accomplish the purpose? Which should address and potentially mitigate or reduce the problem itself. So notice we started with the problem, we ended with the problem. In the middle is sort of the interview questions or whatever it is you're doing to actually collect the data on the most granular on plane, or in the most granular sense. So this is sort of the cycle of alignment, I'll call it for now. I may come up with a better name sometime, but just sort of speaking about how this works. This is how the logical argument, and by argument I don't mean conflict, I mean the logical discussion that you need to present to your readers so that they'll understand, here's the problem I chose and here's why, and that leads me to this purpose. Let me explain it just to make sure you understand how it fits. and here's a framework that I believe fits, and here's my justification. Here are research questions that will carry out the purpose, but they're infused with wording from the framework. And then here are interview questions that will actually get at the bare bones of the concepts and constructs and the actual questions I would ask to an actual person. Research questions are overarching and general. They're somewhat vague. They're about a specific sample instead of asked to a specific person. So how do secondary ed teachers feel about switching to virtual education? That is a general question, but if I'm talking to a secondary ed instructor in person, I'm going to say, how do you feel about it? I'm going to ask them an actual question. A lot of people get those confused and they'll write a research question. How do you feel about switching to virtual education? And I always write, this is not a research question. This is more of an interview question. So overarching questions are research questions. Direct questions to a person, those are interview questions. And they should do the bidding of the research question. One thing to note here is that we really want to make sure that our framework fits. If we don't infuse the framework into our research questions, let's say 1, 2, and did I have a 3? Student emotional health. So now we have 3. I'm going to bold them just to point them out. Now we could have a situation where we only focused on A and B from the theory, because those might be the most relevant and the third one might not be as relevant. Or in some cases people will want to use more than one framework. I typically advise my doctoral students to focus and to only use one framework because it allows you to sort of put more effort into one basket. So what we need to see here is that the framework really matters. If we don't infuse our research questions and thus our interview questions with wording, constructs, concepts from the framework, from the logic of the framework, if we don't infuse that logic into the research questions, then we're going to end up with data later that we might not be able to explain with our framework. By pre-planning, by pre-infusing the research questions and thus the data collection process that will follow, by doing that with our knowledge and understanding of the framework and by infusing it, by sort of seeding it, we are making sure that we are going to understand our phenomena. We're making the choice to sort of constrict. It is a delimitation of sorts, to constrict our understanding of the phenomena to some degree to the framework and how the framework provides understanding of that phenomena. That's why you need to find a good framework that doesn't just bite off a piece of what you're trying to deal with, but can give you a large understanding. And you might expand on that framework. That's what we're always doing in doctoral studies, is we're expanding on framework. We're building, and we're trying a framework with a new population. Like this framework has never been used. It's been used with secondary ed instructors, but it hasn't been used with college professors, or it hasn't been used with hybrid teachers, or whatever, or the student success theory. Let's say that's about doctoral students. Typically, it was created and sort of studied originally with doctoral students in mind. Well, what about K-12? Does it work with K-12 students? And does it have, does it still fit for them? When we're doing research, we're always expanding, extending theory to a new sample or population, or using a theory in a way that it has not previously been used. And thus we're adding theoretical understanding. We're advancing the guiding framework. So let me make sure I've covered everything. So the main things that we were asked to do: present research questions directly answerable and testable. Notice I left out specific there because specificity is important. You don't want something so vague that you can't answer it clearly. But qualitative research questions will be a bit more vague and overarching, and they'll have sort of more vague wording than a quantitative study, which will ask specifically about a relationship or an influence, causality situation, a correlation, perhaps. Is it answerable and testable? You don't want to ask a question that is not feasible to have any real response to. Within the given time frame, you don't want to set up a longitudinal study if you're going to run out of money, or the university doesn't allow a longitudinal study, which is pretty common for a dissertation. Longitudinal studies take years sometimes, or many, many years, sometimes 30, 50 years. You don't want to be doing your dissertation probably for 30 to 50 years because you might not finish. So think about the time frame, location you have identified already probably in the problem, and purpose statements. Include those exact same variables and constructs, participants. Make sure that everything matches, that you haven't sort of asked a different thing here. You were talking about K-12, now you've switched to secondary only, or you switched to higher ed, or you were talking about doctoral students, now you're talking about K through 12 students. Whatever it is, you want to remain consistent. Again, well, I don't think I've said this, so let's go with how many RQs. So generally for a qual, I would say 1 to 5 max. I would say the less the better, but really 2 to 3 is pretty common. 1 may not get at it very much, and that might mean that you're only really pulling one construct from a theory. It can work, it just depends. So work with your chair on that. I'm not trying to answer every single question here. Quant, this can have anything from 1 to 10. I've seen studies where you're basically just asking about one sort of causal, potential causal effect, but there are other things where if you have enough variables and moderators and mediators, then you could have potentially 10 or 20. Hopefully not 20, because that'd be a whole lot of research questions and hypotheses. But you could have more like, a lot more quantitative questions potentially. It's really not about the number, but about having a feasible amount of research questions that cover the material in a way that will produce important and understandable results. So that's really what you're trying to set yourself up for. I look forward to speaking with you again soon. Thank you.